12-year-old boy claims to be Lech Kaczyński and reveals shocking facts about the day of the plane crash. The history classroom at Warsaw's St. Stanisław Kostka Middle School fell into stunned silence as Tomasz Kowalski clutched the edge of his desk, his face suddenly pale and his eyes unfocused. Their teacher, Mrs. Jabłonska, had been discussing modern Polish history and had just begun to explain the significance of the 2010 Smolensk air disaster when Tomasz's strange behavior drew everyone's attention. It was foggy, much worse than the forecasts indicated, the boy said, his voice suddenly deeper and his cadence dramatically altered. I remember looking out the window and barely being able to see the wingtip. Mrs. Jabłonska approached his desk cautiously. Tomasz, are you feeling all right? The boy didn't seem to hear her. His eyes remained fixed on some invisible point in the distance as he continued speaking, now in a formal tone that sounded unnervingly like archival footage of presidential addresses. Captain Protasiuk turned to say something to me. He was concerned about the visibility. I could see the tension in his posture, but there was such pressure to land. The anniversary ceremony at Katyn couldn't proceed without us. A murmur rippled through the classroom. Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others began recording with their phones. Piotr, seated behind Tomasz, whispered to his neighbor, "Is he pretending to be President Kaczyński?" Mrs. Jabłonska gestured for the students to put their phones away as she knelt beside Tomasz's desk. "Tomasz, perhaps you should visit the nurse. You don't look well." At the sound of his name, the boy blinked several times, his expression clearing as he seemed to return to himself. He looked around in confusion at the silent classroom and his concerned teacher. "I'm sorry. What happened?" he asked, his voice once again that of a typical 12-year-old. "You were saying something about fog and a captain," Mrs. Jabłonska explained gently. "You seemed elsewhere." Tomasz's confusion appeared genuine. "I don't remember saying anything. I just had this really vivid, like a daydream or something." Later that afternoon, in the modest apartment near Warsaw's Łazienki Park, where the Kowalski family lived, Tomasz's mother, Agnieszka, listened with growing concern as Mrs. Jabłonska explained the incident over the phone. "Has he shown any unusual interest in political history before?" the teacher asked. The level of detail he displayed about the presidential plane was quite remarkable for someone his age. "No, nothing like that," Agnieszka replied, watching her son through the kitchen doorway as he sat at the dining table, seemingly absorbed in his mathematics homework. "He's never shown any particular interest in the Smolensk crash. We don't even discuss politics much at home." After ending the call, Agnieszka joined her son at the table. "Tomasz, Mrs. Jabłonska tells me you had some kind of episode in class today. Do you want to talk about it?" The boy looked up from his textbook, his expression troubled. "Mom, something weird happened. When Mrs. Jabłonska started talking about the president's plane crash, I suddenly had these memories. Except they weren't my memories. I was on the plane. I was looking out the window. I could feel the seat under me, smell the leather upholstery and someone's cologne, like an imagination game," Agnieszka suggested, trying to keep her tone light despite her concern. Tomasz shook his head emphatically. "No, it was real. Like I was actually there. Like I was him, President Kaczyński. And it wasn't just today. I've been having dreams about it for weeks, ever since we visited that exhibition at the Museum of Polish History." This revelation troubled Agnieszka even more. The family had indeed visited the museum's special exhibition commemorating modern Polish democracy the previous month, which had included a section on the Smolensk tragedy. She hadn't noticed Tomasz paying particular attention to that display at the time. That evening, after Tomasz had gone to bed, Agnieszka discussed the situation with her husband Jakub. The school counselor suggested we consult a child psychologist, she explained. She thinks it might be a stress reaction of some kind. Jakub, a pragmatic electrical engineer, seemed less concerned. He's at an impressionable age, and that museum exhibition was quite emotionally charged. Perhaps his mind is just processing it in an unusual way. But he described details of the crash that weren't in the museum display. Agnieszka insisted. Mrs. Jabłonska said he mentioned specific conversations with the pilot that she doesn't think were ever made public. He must have read about it online or seen a documentary, Jakub reasoned. You know how kids absorb information these days. Despite her husband's reassurances, Agnieszka scheduled an appointment with Dr. Marta Wiśniewska, a child psychologist recommended by Tomasz's school counselor. Dr. Wiśniewska's office was deliberately designed to be comfortable rather than clinical, with natural light, comfortable seating, and tasteful artwork on the walls. During their first session, she spent time building rapport with Tomasz before gently steering the conversation toward the classroom incident. Your mother tells me you've been having some unusual experiences lately, she began. Would you like to tell me about them? Tomasz fidgeted with the sleeve of his sweater. You're going to think I'm crazy. I don't think people are crazy for having experiences they don't understand, Dr. Wiśniewska assured him. I'm just curious about what you've been feeling. The boy was quiet for a moment before responding. I think I might have been President Kaczynski in another life, before I was born as me. He watched the psychologist's face carefully for signs of disbelief, but Dr. Wiśniewska's expression remained neutral and attentive. That's a significant feeling to have, she acknowledged. What makes you think this might be the case? I have memories that aren't mine, Tomasz explained, his words coming faster now. When our teacher started talking about the Smolensk crash, I suddenly remembered being on the plane, not just imagining it, really being there. I could feel the vibrations of the engines, hear the crew talking, feel how tight my collar was around my neck. Have you had other memories like this? Tomasz nodded. Almost every night now. I dream about signing papers at a big desk with the Polish eagle behind me. I remember walking through the presidential palace and knowing exactly where every room is. I remember private conversations with my wife. With his wife, Maria, and with his brother, Jarosław. Over the next hour, Dr. Wiśniewska gently explored these experiences with Tomasz. She was struck by the level of specific detail in his accounts, including protocols for state visits, security procedures, and personal relationships within the presidential administration. Some details could potentially be researched by a curious child, but others seemed remarkably obscure. The most compelling aspects were Tomasz's descriptions of President Kaczynski's private emotional states, his concerns about certain policy decisions, his relationship with his twin brother, and particularly his thoughts on the morning of the fateful flight to Smolensk. I was worried about the weather reports, but canceling wasn't really an option, Tomasz explained, his manner shifting subtly as he spoke. The Katyn commemoration was too important symbolically. The Russians had already made things difficult by holding their own separate ceremony with Prime Minister Putin a few days earlier. If I hadn't shown up for the Polish commemoration, it would have been seen as conceding something important. You speak as if you were him in these moments, Dr. Wiśniewska observed. Tomasz looked down at his hands. It feels like I know it sounds impossible. I'm not here to judge what's possible or impossible, the psychologist assured him. I'm interested in understanding what these experiences mean for you. At the end of the session, Dr. Wisniewska met briefly with Agnieszka, while Tomasz waited in the reception area. "Is my son all right?" Agnieszka asked anxiously. "Is this something we should be worried about?" "Tomasz seems to be a well-adjusted, intelligent boy," Dr. Wisniewska replied carefully. "These experiences are unusual, certainly, but he doesn't appear to be in any psychological distress because of them. I'd like to continue meeting with him weekly to monitor the situation. But where is this coming from? The idea that he was President Kaczynski in a past life?" The psychologist considered her response thoughtfully. There are various perspectives on experiences like these. Some might view them through the lens of reincarnation beliefs, while others might see them as a form of cryptomnesia, unconsciously absorbed information resurfacing as apparent memories. What interests me professionally is not so much the metaphysical question, but how Tomasz integrates these experiences into his understanding of himself. In the weeks that followed, Tomasz's episodes became more frequent. He began to display knowledge of political events and diplomatic relationships that seemed beyond what a 12-year-old could have researched. His parents were particularly unsettled when he correctly identified a visiting family friend as a former junior staff member from the presidential administration, someone who had worked briefly for President Kaczynski years before Tomasz was born, and whose connection had never been mentioned in the Kowalski home. "John worked in the Economic Affairs Office in 2008, Tomasz said casually upon being introduced to the man. "You always brought those caramel cookies to meetings, from that bakery near your mother's apartment." John Nowicki had turned pale. "How could you possibly know that?" "It's true, but I don't think I've ever mentioned those details to anyone outside the administration." The incident with Jan prompted Agnieszka to reach out to Dr. Wisniewska again, this time with more urgency. The psychologist suggested a consultation with a colleague who specialized in unusual memory phenomena and had documented other cases of children with apparent past life memories. Dr. Stefan Adamski, a respected neuropsychologist with a research interest in exceptional cognitive experiences, agreed to meet with Tomasz after reviewing Dr. Wisniewska's initial case notes. The meeting took place in a comfortable conference room at the university where Dr. Adamski held a research position. "I'd like to try something, if you're comfortable with it, Tomasz," Dr. Adamski suggested, after they had spent some time getting acquainted. "I'm going to show you some photographs and documents, and I'd like you to tell me if you recognize them or have any thoughts about them." He presented a series of images, some related to President Kaczynski's administration, and others included as controls. Tomasz correctly identified obscure staffers from the presidential office, recognized the interior of rarely photographed rooms in the presidential palace, and even pointed out changes that had been made to certain spaces since 2010. Most remarkably, when shown a document with sections deliberately blacked out, Tomasz was able to describe the missing content with what later verification would confirm was perfect accuracy. "This was a briefing on the Baltic Energy Security Initiative," he said, studying the heavily redacted page. "The missing paragraph discussed concerns about Russian pipeline leverage and the proposed alternative routing through Denmark." Dr. Adamski made careful notes. The document in question was from a classified security briefing that had only recently been partially declassified. The redacted sections remained confidential, yet Tomasz had described their content correctly. "Tomasz, what do you remember about the day of the crash itself?" Dr. Adamski asked finally, watching the boy carefully. A shadow seemed to pass over Tomasz's face. He was quiet for so long that Dr. Adamski thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had once again taken on that unsettling quality of an adult's cadence in a child's register. I remember checking my watch as we began the final approach. I remember the tension in the cabin. The military attaché had just passed me a note about changes to the ceremony schedule, and I was reading it when Captain Protasyuk announced we were beginning our descent. He paused, his expression distant. The most important thing, the thing people don't fully understand, is that there were warning signs before we even boarded that morning. Technical issues that were downplayed. Weather reports that were more concerning than what was officially communicated to us, and conversations among the delegation that revealed how much diplomatic pressure there was for us to land at Smolensk North, despite alternatives being available. Are you suggesting there was negligence? Dr. Adamski asked carefully. Not a conspiracy, if that's what you're asking, Tomasz replied with a maturity beyond his years. But yes, a cascading series of small negligences, poor decisions, and diplomatic pressures that collectively led to a tragedy that might have been avoided. The official investigations captured much of this, but not the full human complexity of the situation. As Tomasz spoke, Dr. Adamski found himself increasingly unsettled. The boy wasn't merely repeating conspiracy theories or news reports. He was describing the psychological and interpersonal dynamics of the situation in a way that seemed impossibly nuanced for a child, or indeed for anyone who hadn't been there. After this session, Dr. Adamski met privately with Tomasz's parents and Dr. Wiśniewska. I've documented cases of children with unusual access to information before, he explained. But Tomasz's case is exceptional in its specificity and accuracy. While I maintain scientific skepticism about reincarnation claims, I must acknowledge that I cannot currently provide a conventional explanation for the breadth and depth of his knowledge about President Kaczynski and the Smolensk crash. So what do we do? Jakub asked, his earlier skepticism now replaced with visible concern. For now, we continue to support Tomasz and monitor these experiences, Dr. Adamski advised. Whatever their source, they don't appear to be causing him psychological harm. In fact, he seems to be integrating them remarkably well into his sense of self. My primary concern would be the social and media attention if this became widely known. We've already instructed his classmates and teachers to maintain his privacy, Agnieszka assured him. But we can't keep this contained forever, especially if he continues to have episodes in public. As the adults discussed his future, Tomasz sat in his bedroom at home, carefully writing in a journal Dr. Wiśniewska had suggested he keep. His neat handwriting filled page after page with memories that seemed impossibly detailed. Diplomatic meetings, policy discussions, and personal reflections from a life he couldn't possibly have lived. On the final page of that day's entry, he wrote, I still don't understand why this is happening to me, but I feel like there's something important I'm supposed to remember, or maybe something important I'm supposed to do. Whatever the truth is about who I was before, I know who I am now. I'm still Tomasz, but I'm also carrying someone else's unfinished business. Word of Tomasz's unusual case began to spread in limited academic circles. Dr. Adamski, while maintaining the boy's privacy, consulted discreetly with colleagues specializing in exceptional psychological phenomena. The case attracted the attention of Professor Elżbieta Majewska, a respected researcher from the University of Warsaw who had documented similar cases of children with apparent past life memories. One crisp October morning, Professor Majewska accompanied Dr. Adamski to the Kowalski home for a carefully structured interview with Tomasz. His parents had agreed to the meeting on the condition that it remain confidential and focused on understanding their son's experiences rather than validating any particular explanation. I've been reviewing Dr. Adamski's notes, Professor Majewska explained gently to Tomasz as they sat in the family's living room. I'm curious about how these memories come to you. Do they arrive suddenly, or do certain things trigger them? Tomasz considered the question thoughtfully. Usually, something triggers them. When Mrs. Jablonska mentioned Smolensk in history class, it was like a door opened in my mind. Sometimes it's pictures or news clips about President Kaczynski. Or places. When we drove past the presidential palace last month, I could suddenly remember the layout of every room, even which floorboards creaked. And how do these memories feel different from your normal memories as Tomasz? They're clearer in some ways, more detailed. I can remember the smell of the leather chairs in the presidential office, or exactly how the light came through the windows at different times of day, he explained. But they're also heavier, I guess, like they come with feelings and responsibilities that aren't really mine. Aren't really Tomasz's. Professor Majewska nodded encouragingly. That's a very articulate way to describe it. Would you be willing to try something with me today? I'd like to show you some photographs that haven't been published, to see if they spark any recognition. With the Kowalski's permission, she presented a series of images, private photographs from President Kaczynski's time in office that had been provided by a former staff member for research purposes. They included casual moments at private events and working sessions that had never been released to the media. Tomasz studied each photo carefully. In several cases, he identified individuals by name and role without prompting, including junior staff members whose positions would not have been public knowledge. When shown a photograph of an informal gathering at a government retreat, he pointed to a man partially obscured in the background. That's Minister Kaczmarek. He wasn't supposed to be at this meeting. It was about the missile defense negotiations with the Americans, and he didn't have security clearance for those discussions yet. He was only there because we were discussing the budget implications afterward. Professor Majewska made a note. This specific detail, the context of the meeting and Minister Kaczmarek's limited clearance status, aligned with confidential records, but had never been publicly disclosed. The most compelling moment came when Tomasz was shown a photograph of President Kaczynski's desk in his private office. "There's something wrong with this picture," he said immediately. "The arrangement is incorrect. The family photograph should be on the left, not the right. And his favorite pen, the one from the Solidarity anniversary, is missing. He always kept it in that small wooden holder, just here." He pointed to an empty spot on the desk. Professor Majewska exchanged glances with Dr. Adamski. The photograph had been taken during a minor renovation of the office, when items had been temporarily rearranged. This particular detail would have been impossible for Tomasz to research. As the session continued, Tomasz began to speak more specifically about the day of the crash. His demeanor changed subtly, his posture straightened, his vocabulary shifted, and his gestures became more measured. "The morning of the flight, I had a brief phone conversation with my brother," he said, his voice taking on that disconcertingly adult cadence. Yarosław was concerned about the weather reports. There had been fog in Smolensk for several days. He suggested I consider delaying the visit, but the diplomatic implications would have been problematic. The Russians had already created complications with their separate ceremony. He paused, rubbing his temples as if trying to organize his thoughts. What many people don't understand is the context of that journey. It wasn't just another state visit. Katyn has profound significance for Poland. The massacre of our officers there had been denied by the Soviets for decades. This commemoration was an opportunity for historical reconciliation, for acknowledgement of painful truths. Canceling or postponing was not a simple decision. Professor Majewska listened attentively, noting the sophistication of Tomasz's geopolitical analysis, far beyond what would be expected from a 12-year-old. "What do you remember about boarding the aircraft that morning?" she asked. Tomasz's expression grew distant. There was a slight delay. One of the security briefings ran long. The mood was somber but purposeful. I remember greeting several delegation members on the tarmac. Professor Kuczorski was concerned about some papers he'd forgotten, historical documents he wanted to present at the ceremony. Someone went to retrieve them, which added to the delay. Dr. Adamski made a note. This specific incident with Professor Kuczorski had been mentioned in testimonies from staff members, but had not been included in major media reports about the day. As the session continued, Tomasz provided increasingly detailed recollections of the flight itself, technical discussions with the flight crew, conversations among delegation members, and his own thoughts as they approached Smolensk. The descent began, and I could see nothing but whiteness outside the window, he said, his voice growing quieter. Captain Protasiuk announced we were beginning our approach. There was tension in his voice. The Russian air traffic controllers were providing altitude information that seemed inconsistent with what our instruments were showing. He stopped suddenly, pressing his hands against his eyes. I don't want to remember the rest. Not today. Professor Majewska respected his boundary immediately. That's perfectly all right, Tomasz. We can stop here. After the session concluded, and Tomasz had gone to his room to rest, the researchers discussed their observations with his parents. His knowledge of unpublished details is remarkable, Professor Majewska acknowledged. I've documented cases of children with unusual memories before, but the specificity and accuracy here is exceptional. But what does it mean? Agnieszka asked, the strain of recent weeks evident in her voice. How can our son know these things? There are several frameworks for understanding such phenomena, Professor Majewska explained carefully. Some religious and philosophical traditions would interpret this as evidence of reincarnation or soul memory. From a psychological perspective, there are concepts like genetic or ancestral memory, though those wouldn't typically account for such specific personal details. And then there's the possibility of what we might call anomalous information reception. Access to knowledge through means we don't yet understand scientifically. Are there others like him? Jakub asked. Other children who remember being specific people? There are documented cases, yes, Dr. Adamski confirmed. Professor Majewska's research includes several instances of children with detailed memories of recently deceased individuals. What makes Tomasz's case particularly noteworthy is the recency and prominence of President Kaczynski, as well as the verifiable nature of many of his recollections. As the adults continued their discussion, none of them noticed Tomasz standing quietly in the hallway, listening. That night, he wrote in his journal, "They're trying to understand what's happening to me, but I'm not sure they can. Sometimes, I'm not even sure I understand it myself. Am I Tomasz with strange memories of being President Kaczynski? Or am I somehow President Kaczyński continuing as Tomasz? Tomasz. The memories keep getting stronger and clearer, especially about the crash. I think there's something important I need to remember, something that would help make sense of why this is happening." In the weeks that followed, Tomasz's episodes became more frequent and more detailed. He began to sketch intricate diagrams of the presidential palace, the government complex in Warsaw, and, most concerning to his parents, detailed drawings of the Tu-154M aircraft, including technical aspects of its navigation and communication systems. During a session with Dr. Wisniewska, Tomasz produced a drawing of what he described as anomalies in the navigation system readings from the final moments of the flight. The altitude indicators were giving inconsistent information, he explained, pointing to his technical diagram with surprising confidence. What the Russian controllers were telling us didn't match what our instruments were showing. There was confusion in the cockpit about our actual position relative to the runway. Dr. Wisniewska studied the drawing with concern. Tomasz, how do you know these technical details about aircraft systems? I received a briefing on the Tu-154's systems after we had a minor technical issue during a flight to Brussels the previous year, he replied matter-of-factly. As president, I felt it was important to understand the aircraft that carried our delegations. The casual shift between referring to himself as Tomasz and identifying with President Kaczynski had become increasingly common, as if the boundaries between these identities were growing more permeable. The situation took an unexpected turn when Jan Nowicki, the former presidential staff member who had previously encountered Tomasz, contacted the Kowalskis with an unusual request. A small group of former colleagues from President Kaczynski's administration wished to meet with Tomasz. They had heard about the boy through private channels and were both skeptical and curious. After careful consideration and discussions with Dr. Wisniewska and Dr. Adamski, the Kowalskis agreed to a controlled meeting. It would take place in a neutral setting, a private room at the university where Dr. Adamski worked, with the psychologists present to ensure Tomasz's well-being remained the priority. On a Sunday afternoon in November, Tomasz met with 3 former members of President Kaczynski's staff: Jan Nowicki, who had worked in economic affairs, Marta Dąbrowska, who had served as a foreign policy advisor, and Andrzej Wojcik, who had been part of the president's security detail. All 3 had been with the administration until 2010, though none had been on the fatal flight. The meeting began tentatively. The former staffers were clearly uncomfortable, unsure how to interact with a child who claimed to possess their former leader's memories. Tomasz himself seemed unusually shy at first, watching the adults with cautious eyes. Marta Dąbrowska broke the ice. I understand you've been having some unusual memories, Tomasz. Perhaps you could tell us about them? The boy studied her for a moment. We met in 2006, he said finally. You were recommended by Minister Kowalczyk after your work on the Eastern Partnership Initiative. You always prepared briefing documents with blue folders instead of the standard ones, because you said it made important information easier to find quickly. Marta's composure faltered visibly. That's correct. About the blue folders, I mean, it was a personal habit of mine, not something that would have been publicly known. As the conversation continued, Tomasz recalled specific meetings, policy discussions, and personal interactions with increasing confidence. He referenced private jokes that had circulated among the staff, security protocols that had never been disclosed publicly, and personal habits of the 3 visitors that left them visibly shaken. Most compelling was his interaction with Andrzej Wojcik, the former security officer. You were there that morning, Tomasz said suddenly, his attention focusing on Wojcik. You were supposed to be on the flight. Your name was on the original manifest. The room fell silent. Wojcik, a composed man in his early 50s, paled visibly. That's true, he acknowledged quietly. I was replaced at the last minute because my mother had suffered a stroke the night before. I've always carried a certain guilt about that I wasn't there. Tomasz's expression softened with a compassion that seemed beyond his years. You shouldn't feel guilty. There was nothing anyone could have done once we were in the air. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, with Tomasz providing increasingly specific recollections that the former staffers confirmed were accurate. When it finally concluded, the 3 visitors stepped into the hallway with Dr. Adamski, while Tomasz remained with his parents and Dr. Wisniewska. I came here as a skeptic, Jan Nowicki admitted, his voice unsteady. I thought perhaps the boy had somehow researched our administration or was repeating information leaked to him. But what I've witnessed today, he knew things that only someone in our closest circles could have known. private conversations, confidential decisions, personal moments. "What are you suggesting?" Dr. Adamski asked carefully. Marta Dombrovska, the policy advisor, spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to diplomatic phrasing. "I'm not prepared to make metaphysical claims, but I can state unequivocally that Tomasz Kowalski demonstrated knowledge today that, by conventional understanding, he should not possess." In the following days, word of the meeting spread through a widening circle of former administration officials. Sewanfiu more requested to meet with Tomasz, some out of curiosity, others seeking some form of closure after the tragedy that had claimed their colleagues and leader. The Kowalskis, concerned about the emotional impact on their son, limited these interactions. But Tomasz himself seemed increasingly driven to connect with people from President Kaczynski's life, as if these encounters helped him integrate the disparate aspects of his consciousness. A particularly meaningful meeting occurred with Father Mariusz Kozłowski, who had served as a spiritual advisor to President Kaczynski. The elderly priest approached the situation with an open mind, informed by both faith and reason. "In our tradition, we believe in the immortality of the soul, but not typically in its return to another earthly life," he explained gently to Tomasz during their conversation. "Yet God's ways are mysterious, beyond our full comprehension." Tomasz nodded thoughtfully. "I understand why this is difficult to accept. It's difficult for me, too. I'm still Tomasz. I have my own memories, my own life. But these other memories are also real to me. They have a purpose, though I'm still trying to understand what that purpose is." "What do you believe that purpose might be?" the priest asked. The boy was quiet for a moment, his expression serious beyond his years. I think there are truths about the crash that need to be understood. Not conspiracy theories or political accusations, but a fuller human understanding of what happened and why, and maybe some kind of completion, resolution, for me, for him, for everyone affected by the tragedy. As winter descended on Warsaw, Tomasz's case attracted attention from a broader range of researchers, including Dr. Helena Nowak, a specialist in aviation psychology who had consulted on several air crash investigations. After reviewing the documentation compiled by Dr. Adamski and Professor Majewska, she requested permission to meet with Tomasz to discuss his memories of the flight specifically. The Kowalskis hesitated, concerned that focusing on the traumatic memories of the crash might be harmful to their son. But Tomasz himself expressed a desire to speak with Dr. Nowak. "I think it might help," he told his parents. "The memories of the crash are the most disturbing ones. Maybe talking about them with someone who understands aircraft accidents will help make sense of them." The meeting took place just before Christmas. Dr. Nowak, a practical woman in her 50s, with experience investigating aviation incidents, approached the situation with professional curiosity rather than skepticism or belief. "I'd like to understand what you remember about the sequence of events during the approach to Smolensk," she explained to Tomasz. "Not to question the official investigations, but to see if your recollections might offer additional context." What followed was the most detailed account Tomasz had yet provided of the flight's final moments. He described the communications between the cockpit crew and Russian air traffic control, the conflicting information about their altitude and position, and the growing tension as visibility remained severely limited. "There was a moment when I heard Captain Protasiuk say something about the readings not making sense," Tomasz recalled, his voice steady but quiet. The autopilot had disengaged, which was standard procedure for the final approach. But there seemed to be confusion about our exact position relative to the runway. Dr. Nowak listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about technical details. Much of what Tomasz described aligned with information from the flight recorders, but some elements, particularly about cockpit conversations that occurred during gaps in the recordings, could not be verified against existing evidence. "What stands out most in your memory from those final moments?" she asked finally. Tomasz closed his eyes briefly. Not fear, exactly. There wasn't time for fear. More a sudden, complete clarity. A realization that something was wrong, that we were too low, too soon. I remember the navigator calling out an altitude warning. I remember the sound of the terrain awareness alarm activating. And then, nothing. Dr. Nowak's report to Dr. Adamski and the Kowalskis was measured but significant. While she could not verify all of Tomasz's recollections against official evidence, his description of the sequence of events, the technical issues with navigation systems, and the human factors involved in the accident demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of aviation that would be remarkable even in an adult with no flight training. Whether one views this through a spiritual, psychological, or some other framework, she concluded, the consistency and technical accuracy of his recollections are difficult to explain through conventional means. As winter gave way to spring in Warsaw, the circle of people aware of Tomasz's case had widened to include select journalists, government officials, and religious figures. The Kowalskis, with guidance from Dr. Adamski and Dr. Wiśniewska, carefully managed these interactions to protect their son from exploitation or undue stress. Despite their efforts, rumors had begun to circulate on social media and in certain political circles about a child with an unexplainable connection to the late president. The situation reached a turning point when Jarosław Kaczyński, the late president's identical twin brother and a powerful political figure in Poland, requested a meeting with Tomasz. The request came through official channels, delivered with formal courtesy but unmistakable authority. The Kowalskis were deeply conflicted. On one hand, if anyone had a legitimate interest in Tomasz's memories, it would be the president's own brother. On the other hand, they feared the political implications and media attention that might follow such a high-profile encounter. After consulting with their team of advisors, they agreed to a private meeting with strict conditions: no media, no political staff, and the meeting would end immediately if Tomasz showed any signs of distress. Dr. Wiśniewska would be present throughout. The meeting took place on a quiet Sunday afternoon at a secure government facility that offered privacy from media attention. Jarosław Kaczyński arrived alone, without the security detail that typically accompanied him. Despite his powerful position, he appeared surprisingly vulnerable as he was introduced to Tomasz, a child who claimed to possess his twin brother's memories. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said formally to the Kowalskis before turning his attention to Tomasz. For a long moment, he simply studied the boy, perhaps searching for some sign or connection to his lost brother. Tomasz, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all morning, looked up at the man who so closely resembled the face he saw in his memories. The resemblance between the late president and his twin had always been striking, though years of grief had etched deeper lines into Jarosław's features. "You changed your apartment," Tomasz said suddenly, breaking the silence. "After what happened, you used to have the blue armchair by the window, the one Mother gave you. You moved it to the study because you couldn't sit there anymore without remembering our conversations." Jarosław Kaczyński's composure faltered visibly. This detail about furniture rearrangement in his private residence after his brother's death was not something that had ever been published or discussed publicly. "May we sit?" he asked quietly, indicating the arranged seating area. For the next hour, Jarosław listened as Tomasz spoke about memories that only the Kaczyński brothers should have shared: childhood experiences, private jokes, disagreements about policy matters, and late-night phone calls discussing personal concerns. The boy referenced specific conversations with a precision that left Yaroslav alternately pale and flushed with emotion. The night before the flight, you called to discuss the weather conditions in Smolensk. Tomasz said at one point, you were concerned about reports of heavy fog. You suggested I consider postponing, but we both knew that wasn't really an option given the significance of the Katyn commemoration. The diplomatic implications of cancellation would have been complex. Yaroslav nodded almost imperceptibly. I've never spoken publicly about that conversation. You blamed yourself afterward, Tomasz continued softly. You thought if you had insisted more strongly, perhaps I would have reconsidered. But that isn't fair to you. The decision was mine, based on the information available and the importance of the occasion. By the end of the meeting, Yaroslav Kaczyński, a man known for his reserved public persona and steely political resolve, was visibly moved. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Tomasz's parents. I came here skeptical, despite the reports I had received. I thought perhaps this was some elaborate deception, or maybe a child with an unusual talent for research and performance, he admitted. I no longer believe that to be the case. Your son knows things that only my brother could have known. Personal matters never documented or shared with others. What do you make of it, then? Agnieszka asked carefully. Yaroslav considered his answer thoughtfully. I'm not prepared to make theological or metaphysical claims, but I will say this. Whatever the explanation, your son has provided me with something I thought impossible. A final conversation with my brother, of sorts. For that, I am grateful. Before leaving, he spoke briefly with Tomasz alone, with Dr. Wisniewska observing from a discreet distance. Whatever passed between them remained private, but both seemed more at peace afterward. That evening, Tomasz made a request that surprised his parents. He wanted to visit the presidential palace. Not as a tourist, he clarified. I need to see the office again, the private spaces. I think it might help me understand why these memories came to me. After consultation with Dr. Wisniewska and careful arrangements with palace officials, a private visit was arranged for the following weekend. The palace staff was told only that Tomasz was a special guest with a scholarly interest in presidential history. The full nature of his connection was shared with just the head of security, who had served during President Kaczynski's administration. Walking through the formal rooms of the palace, Tomasz displayed the now familiar transformation in his demeanor, his posture straightening, his gait becoming more measured, his observations more precise. He navigated the complex layout with confidence, occasionally noting changes that had been made since 2010. The most powerful moment came when he entered the presidential office. Standing in the doorway, he fell completely silent, his expression a complex mixture of recognition, loss, and something like homecoming. May I have a moment alone? He asked quietly. His parents exchanged concerned glances with Dr. Wisniewska, who nodded reassurance. We'll be just outside the door, Agnieszka told her son. For 10 minutes, Tomasz remained in the office by himself. Through the partially open door, they could see him moving slowly around the space, touching the desk, looking out the windows, running his hand along the bookshelf. He seemed to be saying goodbye. When he emerged, his face was tear-streaked but peaceful. I'm ready to go now, he said simply. In the car returning home, he spoke more than he had in days, but notably, he spoke as Tomasz, with no trace of the presidential cadence or vocabulary that had characterized his episodes. It's strange, he told his parents. Being there helped me separate things somehow. Like the memories are still there, but they're more like a book I've read than my own experiences. I still know they happened, but they feel more distant now. This marked a turning point in Tomasz's case. In the weeks that followed, the episodes became less frequent and less intense. He continued to have access to memories and knowledge of President Kaczynski's life, but he no longer shifted into speaking as if he were the president himself. The memories had become integrated into his understanding of himself as Tomasz. Rather than existing as a separate sometimes dominant identity. Dr. Wiśniewska noted this evolution with professional interest. It's as if the visit to the presidential palace provided a form of psychological closure, she explained to the Kowalskis during a follow-up session. The memories haven't disappeared, but they've been contextualized in a way that allows Tomasz to maintain his primary identity while still acknowledging this unusual connection. A significant development occurred in April, just before the anniversary of the Smolensk crash. Professor Majewska, who had continued to document Tomasz's case, received permission from the Kowalskis to present an anonymized version of her findings at a closed academic conference on exceptional psychological phenomena. Her presentation, which maintained Tomasz's privacy by changing identifying details, generated considerable interest among researchers studying consciousness, memory, and unusual cognitive experiences. One such researcher was Dr. Gabriel Nowak, a Polish-American neuroscientist who had developed a specialized protocol for examining what he termed anomalous memory states. With the Kowalskis' consent, Nowak conducted a series of non-invasive cognitive tests with Tomasz, comparing his brain activity patterns when accessing regular memories versus the presidential ones. The preliminary results were intriguing. When Tomasz accessed memories from President Kaczynski's life, his neural activation patterns showed subtle but measurable differences from his normal recall patterns. Dr. Nowak was careful not to overinterpret these findings, noting that they merely documented a physiological distinction without explaining its cause. We can observe that Tomasz's brain functions differently when accessing these presidential memories, he explained to the family and their advisory team. This suggests they're being processed through somewhat distinct neural pathways. But whether this represents a unique form of cryptomnesia, some kind of exceptional intuitive access to information, or something more profound that remains beyond what our current scientific frameworks can definitively explain. As the anniversary of the crash approached, Tomasz expressed a desire to visit the memorial at Powązki Military Cemetery, where many of the victims were honored. His parents were concerned about potential media attention or political complications, but Tomasz was insistent. "I need to be there," he explained, "not as a spectacle or to draw attention, but to properly honor the memory of everyone who was lost. I think it might help the memories find their proper place." On April 10th, the Kowalskis attended the memorial service quietly, staying at the periphery of the gathered crowd. Tomasz stood solemnly between his parents, his expression thoughtful but composed. Several officials who had met him privately during the previous months noticed his presence, but respectfully maintained their distance, honoring the family's desire for privacy. After the formal ceremonies concluded and most attendees had departed, Tomasz approached the memorial wall where the names of all 96 victims were inscribed. He carried a single white rose, which he placed beneath President Kaczynski's name. For several minutes, he stood in silent contemplation, his parents watching from a respectful distance. What happened next was witnessed only by the Kowalskis, Dr. Wiśniewska, and a few lingering visitors. Tomasz placed his small hand against the cold stone of the memorial and whispered something that could not be heard by others. As he did so, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds that had hung over Warsaw all day, illuminating the memorial wall in a moment of unexpected brightness. When he rejoined his parents, Tomasz seemed different somehow, lighter, as if relieved of a burden he had been carrying. On their walk back to the car, he suddenly took his mother's hand, a gesture he had grown too self-conscious for in recent months as he approached his teenage years. "I think I understand now," he told her, "why I had these memories, why they came to me." "Why do you think it was, Kochani?" she asked gently. "Not for politics or to change history or anything dramatic like that," he replied thoughtfully. "Just to remember properly, to honor what happened, and maybe to help some people find peace, like Mr. Kaczynski and the others who lost someone they loved. Maybe some memories are too important to stay only in the past." In the months that followed, Tomasz's episodes continued to decrease in frequency and intensity. By summer, they had largely ceased altogether, though he retained an unusual knowledge of Polish political history and occasionally made observations that reflected his unique perspective. He returned to a more normal childhood, playing soccer with friends, arguing with his parents about screen time, and developing a particular interest in aviation and international relations. The research team, Dr. Adamski, Dr. Wiśniewska, Professor Majewska, and others who had documented his case, continued to analyze their findings. They eventually published a carefully anonymized case study in a respected psychological journal, presenting the facts without advocating for any particular explanation. The paper generated significant academic interest, but, without Tomasz's identity being revealed, little public attention. As for the political and historical implications of Tomasz's memories, they proved less dramatic than some might have expected. His recollections of the crash itself, while detailed and technically sophisticated, ultimately aligned with the fundamental conclusions of the official investigations. A combination of severe weather conditions, navigational difficulties, intense pressure to land despite those conditions, and human error had led to the tragedy. What his perspective added was not a radical alternative explanation, but a more nuanced human context. The diplomatic pressures, personal motivations, and moment-by-moment experiences that official reports, esprits by their nature, could not fully capture. On Tomasz's 13th birthday, his parents gave him a special gift, a journal bound in blue leather, similar to one that had been recovered from the crash site. Inside the front cover, they had inscribed a message: "For our extraordinary son. Some souls carry more memories than others. We are grateful that you have found a way to honor the past while still embracing your own future. With all our love." That evening, after his friends had gone home and the birthday celebrations had concluded, Tomasz sat at his desk and opened the journal to its first blank page. He began to write, not about President Kaczynski or the crash or any of the extraordinary experiences of the past year, but about his own hopes and plans for the future, his interest in perhaps becoming a pilot or a diplomat someday, his thoughts about the new school year, his reflections on growing up. Just once, as he was finishing his entry, he paused and added a postscript. "I still remember sometimes, not as vividly or as often, but the memories are still there, like photographs in an album I can choose to open or leave closed. I used to think it was strange or frightening to carry someone else's memories, but now I understand it differently. We are all, in some way, carriers of memories that came before us, through our families, our nation's history, our shared human experience. Mine just came in a more direct form. I am still Tomasz. But I am Tomasz who remembers, and there is a kind of peace in that." 5 years later, an 18-year-old Tomasz Kowalski stood at the entrance examination for the Polish Air Force Academy. His academic credentials were impeccable. His psychological evaluations showed remarkable stability and maturity, and his motivation to serve my country and honor those who came before me was noted as exemplary by the review committee. Only a very few people knew the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped his childhood and his sense of duty. To most, he was simply an impressive young man with unusual poise and a deep knowledge of Polish history. As he completed his entrance interview, one of the senior officers, a man who had once served on President Kaczynski's security detail and who recognized Tomasz from those private meetings years earlier, asked him a final, unofficial question. "Do you still remember?" Tomasz met his gaze with the quiet confidence that had become his hallmark. "Less and less with each passing year, but enough to understand why I'm here and what matters most." The officer nodded, a gesture of respect between equals despite their difference in age and rank. "That's all any of us can ask for, I suppose, to remember what matters most." As Tomasz left the interview and stepped into the bright Polish sunshine, he felt a momentary double awareness, the eager anticipation of his own future, overlaid with a deep appreciation for the past that had, through extraordinary circumstances, become part of his own life's story. Not a burden anymore, not a mystery to be solved, but simply an unusual thread in the fabric of his identity. The memories of another life had found their proper place, honored but no longer dominant, informing but not defining the person he was continuing to become. And in this integration of past and present, of extraordinary experience and ordinary life, Tomasz Kowalski had found a path forward that honored both the president he had somehow remembered being and the young man he was now choosing to be.